Order. Ms. Marie Rimmer to move the motion.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Miss Ali. This is the first time I've served under your chairmanship too. I beg to move that this House has considered British nationals detained overseas. The first duty of the British government is to protect its citizens, but means at home and abroad. Being arrested or detained abroad can be a difficult and traumatic experience. Often the detained are unable to see their friends and family, sometimes for years. I'm sure, like me, we were all moved by the scenes of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe being reunited with her husband Richard and their daughter Gabriella. Iran has shown itself to be a serial offender of detaining British passport holders. Murad Tabas, a British-American citizen, is still detained there. It's now been over 5 years. It was only last month that Tabas was taken out of Evin prison, the infamous home to many political prisoners of the autocratic regime, and placed under house arrest. Yet this only occurred after America agreed to a prisoner exchange and to allow the Iranian regime to access almost £5 billion of frozen assets in South Korea. In other words, the Iranian regime was using foreign prisoners for ransom. The situation with Nazanin was the same. She was only released after the government paid $400 million to Tehran. Miran Rahouf is another dual British-Iranian national that has been detained. At 66, he was detained in Evin prison for supporting and campaigning for workers' rights. In his own letter, Mr. Rahouf says the Iranian regime is treating dual nationals as a valuable commodity, and the evidence backs him up. The UK government must look at the actions of Iran and label it for what it is, a state hostage-taking. And quite frankly, it's working. The Iranian regime is getting vast sums of money to release foreign or dual nationals that they have arrested on trumped-up charges. The Foreign Office needs to take a much stronger stance within our role in the UN to call out state hostage-taking. Iran is not the only country guilty of unjustly detaining British citizens. Jimmy Lai, a British national and a long-time critic of the Chinese Communist Party, was arrested in Hong Kong over 3 years ago. Yes, of course.
I congratulate her for securing this debate and highlighting these very important issues and very concerning cases of individuals. As chair of the APPG on global media freedom, I share her concern specifically about the case of Jimmy Lai. Does she agree with me that Mr. Lai's case is not only one of appalling consequences for him personally, having served nearly 1,000 days in prison, but it's also emblematic of the Hong Kong government's crusade against free media and freedom of speech?
I certainly agree with your comments that you've made. Mr. Lai is accused of violating the new national security law in Hong Kong. Leaving aside our government's failure to properly hold China to account for reneging on the Sino-British joint declaration, there is still a duty to protect British nationals. Mr. Lai is still awaiting trial this month, yet the Chinese Communist authorities are trying to block his attempt to hire a British defence lawyer.
Would you give way?
Yes, of course.
She is raising a really important point here around people's access to justice when they are detained illegitimately or even legitimately, and also access to consular services. Other countries have a minimum requirement of support from the British government, from their respective governments, Foreign Office and consular services, including the provision of approved lawyers that are approved in those countries but are certified by Britain. Is that something that we should be considering doing and ensuring that the consular services are protecting our nationals wherever they are?
I would agree with the comments, Chair, and of course we should be doing that. It's only about justice, not being rigged justice. The use of foreign lawyers by both prosecutors and defence is a long-established tradition in Hong Kong. Only last month, the Foreign Secretary met with the Chinese Vice President, Mr. Han, known as the architect of China's crackdown in Hong Kong. The Foreign Secretary raised the case of Mr. Lai, but did not go far enough. It is British values that are on trial, the values of freedom and democracy, that we signed a treaty to uphold. The Prime Minister should be raising this with the Chinese regime at the highest possible level. Cases of British citizens being detained abroad are not just limited to the Middle East and Asia. In 2021, Mr. Nnamdi Kanu, a British citizen, was abducted by Nigerian security forces in Nairobi, Kenya. Since his detention, he has been subjected to torture and many other unpleasantries. A United Nations Rights Council report released a damning assessment of Nigeria's government's treatment and called for his immediate release. My right honourable friend from Camberwell and Peckham has worked tirelessly on behalf of Mr. Kanu and is urging the Foreign Secretary to do more to secure his release. Nigeria is a Commonwealth nation that receives tens of millions in UK aid. It is one of the biggest benefactors of aid. Part of this aid support must be a commitment to human rights and upholding the right to fair trials. Mr. Kanu must be given access to a fair and due process. A British citizen travelling on the British passport should not be kidnapped in a third country and dragged to a Nigerian prison. The government needs to get much tougher. The final case I will raise is that of Alaa Abdel Fattah, a British Egyptian activist that was detained in Egypt. Once again, he has been detained, denied fair and due process. He even took to hunger strike in prison to protest against his treatment. The Egyptian authorities also denied his British citizenship and refused British consular support. Our government needs to be insisting that Mr. Abdel Fattah gets this assistance. Only this week, the Foreign Office was told by the Parliamentary Ombudsman to make a formal apology to Matthew Hedges, who was accused of spying and was tortured in the United Arab Emirates. The Foreign Office failed to do their duty to Mr. Hedges, a British citizen being tortured by a country we consider one of our closest allies in the region. The Chief Executive of the Ombudsman's Office, Rebecca Hill-Zenrath, describes Mr. Hedges' experience as a nightmare and that it was made even worse by being failed by the British government. Quite frankly, this is not good enough, and it calls into question whether the current guidelines need reviewing. These cases I have raised today are examples, and there are many others that I could have gone into, and I'm sure other colleagues here today may well do so. I appreciate these are often complex, and no country is the same when it comes to Foreign Office engagement, yet there is much more we can do, especially when it comes to countries we financially support, or where we can work with our allies to take a much tougher stance on state hostage-taking, such as Iran. There are many British citizens detained abroad, that do not even get the necessary consular assistance. That is why Labour are looking to introduce a legal right to consular assistance that I am sure the Shadow Minister will go into in further detail. Consular support to British citizens must be given. After all, it's the first duty of government to look after its citizens.
I remind all members that want to speak, please remember to bob if you... OK, we've got everybody. The question is that this House has considered British nationals detained overseas. Daniel Kaczynski.
Thank you very much, Ms Ali, for calling me in this debate. And I very much agree with the Honourable Lady in her comments that how our country supports and treats its citizens overseas when they are in distress, particularly in prisons, is a very important issue, and I congratulate her on securing this very important debate. I'm just going to speak very briefly on behalf of my constituent, Saiful Chowdhury, who is a leading member of the Muslim community in Shrewsbury and does a great deal to support our mosque in Shrewsbury. Saiful Chowdhury has contacted me because his two cousins, Murad Rahman and Yadur Rahman, were both at the airport in Dubai in February 2023 when they were trying to secure a wheelchair for their elderly mother. They were traveling with their elderly mother and children as a family on holiday in Dubai. They tried to secure a wheelchair for their elderly mother because she had difficulties in walking. And the staff were very unhelpful, very rude, and confrontational with them. Unfortunately, this led to a verbal confrontation between these two British citizens and airport staff, and it has resulted in them being convicted to a 6-month jail sentence. Of course, unfortunately, well, obviously now they are appealing, and they are forced, their passport has been stamped with the stamp which prevents them from leaving the United Arab Emirates, and therefore they are in a hotel at their own expense. They have spent thousands and thousands of pounds already since February 2023 in accommodation, whilst they await for their court process to be concluded. The reason I'm raising this particular case with the Minister, and he is a very good Minister, a very responsive Minister, and I'd like him to take a particular interest in this case. The reason why I feel compelled to raise it with him are because of some of the allegations that have been put forward in terms of no CCT evidence being presented to the court in this case, where the defendants are very keen for that to be shown, to demonstrate that the altercation was purely verbal rather than physical in any way, and yet the authorities refused to allow CCT evidence from the embassy, from the airport. That is the allegation. And the other concern that they have raised is that the repeated refusal of the Emirati authorities to facilitate ongoing and effective dialogue and communication between the defendants and our British embassy officials, and indeed also their lawyers. And, of course, my concern at the length of time this has taken to date. The Honourable Lady mentioned the United Arab Emirates as being one of our closest partners in the Middle East. I would go further. I would say it is the closest British ally in the Middle East. And we have very extensive commercial and political links with the Emiratis. I'm extremely concerned to hear of this case, and I will be giving the Minister the details of this to his Parliamentary Private Secretary. I would be extremely grateful if the Minister would look into this case. I will be sending a copy of the link to this debate to our British Ambassador in the United Arab Emirates, and I'd be extremely grateful to the Minister for any support he may be able to give to Mr. Saiful Chowdhury, my constituent, who was obviously clearly extremely concerned as to the welfare of his cousins and the impact it's having not just on them, but on their elderly relatives and children who have obviously come back to the United Kingdom and are separated from their loved ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ali. I hadn't expected to be called so quickly. I'm very grateful, and I warmly commend my honourable friend on securing this debate, not least because I think all the members of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee have been making arguments about some of these issues for some considerable time. Not least because of the situation regarding Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. It's not just that the former Prime Minister managed to make things more difficult when he appeared before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in suggesting that she was doing other, she was engaged in other activities than she was, and that possibly kept her in Iranian jail for a much longer time than was necessary. But also, I think, as the present Chancellor, who was then Foreign Secretary, has admitted, sometimes we've not devoted enough energy to making sure that British citizens get a fair trial, are treated properly in prisons where they are, and wherever possible, actually, if there is a sentence that has to be served, that sentence can be served in the UK. If I can very briefly just explain one of the things that I did when I was a minister in the Foreign Office for 5 minutes. There was a British woman who was arrested in Laos. I won't name her, but she was pregnant. And she was arrested for an offence which would have been an offence in the United Kingdom. Laos is a very closed country politically, a communist country, very difficult. We at the time didn't have an embassy in Laos. We were being helped by the Australians. And I said, well, I'm sorry, she's pregnant. I don't want a British child to be born in a Lao prison in filthy conditions, likely to have a miserable life, if a life of any kind at all. I want that child to be born in a British prison. And all the officials said, no, nonsense, Minister, it's nothing to do with you. It will simply make life difficult. But I went. I had a difficult but good, thorough meeting with my counterpart in Vientiane. And we had a wonderful lunch afterwards. And it thawed the relationship. And I said, I'm going to ring you every Monday morning. And I rang him every Monday morning. And after 3 months, we got her out, and she came back to a British prison. She has no idea, I'm absolutely sure. And to be honest, I would just gently say to ministers, it may be that they do it all the time and we don't know about it, because I've never told this story before. But that is kind of what a minister is for. There will be times when officials will go, oh, minister, that's very brave, very courageous. But I just think there are times when ministers do need to do exactly that. And another case that is very much prominent at the moment for me is that of Jagtar Singh Johal, who is still in prison in India. As I understand it, our Prime Minister is going to visit India soon. I don't know why he isn't saying quite clearly and categorically that he should be released. Every single independent assessment that has been done shows that this man is innocent of the crimes that he's been fitted up for. But as I understand it, the Foreign Secretary has actually written to say, to the families concerned, to say that he will not raise this matter because it could impact the cooperation we depend on from the relevant authorities to conduct consular visits, resolve welfare cases, and attend court proceedings. I think that is to presume that the Indian government will react negatively. And I just think that every single time we do that, in particular with governments which maybe have a tendency towards autocracy, not so much perhaps in India, but certainly in other countries, all we do is we invite them to adopt a yet more hardline attitude. And this takes me to the situation in China. My honourable friend is absolutely right about the situation facing Jimmy Lai. I understand that the British government position is regularly, well, we don't want to push too far. But I'm sorry, I don't understand why a British Foreign Secretary would go to China and not say before going that some of the people in this room should not be on a sanctions list. I think that is incomprehensible, because it's as if we're saying, I'm sorry, our democracy doesn't really matter. We don't really mind what you're doing. Of course.
I'm very much enjoying his speech. I think 3 Sundays ago, we joined the fastest growing, biggest trading bloc in the world, the CPTPP, in the Far East. Will he agree with me that we ought to use our position in the CPTPP to restrict Chinese entry into this bloc as long as they continue to behave in this manner?
Not only because of the honourable members who are sitting in the and right honourable members who are sitting in the room being sanctioned, but also because of the complete reneging on the agreement that we had with China with regards to Hong Kong. It is when you talk to Hong Kongers who've left Hong Kong, now nearly all leaving with nothing, leaving everything behind them. They talk of fear, genuine fear, for their family back at home if they've stayed. And, of course, I was going to end, but...
I'm sure that the honourable gentleman will get there eventually. I think, or I fear, in fact, the reasons for the non-intervention and non-comment in respect of Jimmy Lai's case are explicable. they're not worthy, but they are inexplicable. But this is a moment where it really matters for Jimmy Lai, because he now has a trial date set for December, and an intervention at this stage, this critical stage in relation to the criminal proceedings against him, could make a material difference to the outcome. Does that not in itself merit a more robust intervention from our own Foreign Secretary?
I think it does, and it was a point I was going to make myself, that this is a very opportune point at which to be making this intervention. But I have another broader point to make, which is that in our foreign affairs, if you ask most people around the world, what is the UK, what is our unique special achievement? It is the rule of law. It is the fact that our word is our bond. It's the fact that you can prosecute a case properly in a legal court in the country, and that we stand for democracy and the freedom of the individual and equality under the law. And if that has to be just as much a part of our foreign policy as our mercantilist desire to do better trade with other parts of the world. And actually, my experience of working on issues in Russia and countries in Central Asia is, if you don't tie the two together, you make a terrible, terrible mistake, because the British businesses simply can't flourish because they have to pay bribes and they have to deal with an autocratic regime. So my only point, Ms. Ali, to conclude is that I very much hope that the UK government will adopt a more robust and more coherent and more determined approach in its relationship with a series of different countries, China, Russia and India.
Well, it's a pleasure to serve under your stewardship, and there are others to speak, so I'll try and keep some of the comments brief. I just want to focus, and I congratulate the Honourable Lady on achieving this debate. It is a vital debate, and we should continue it regularly because there is so much to be done in this area. British citizens carry British passports, and those British passports make a very clear statement at the front of it, which is that none should let or hinder those who hold that passport. And yet, too often, we find ourselves apologising and running around that major statement at the front of the passport. And I therefore want to focus very carefully on the case of Jimmy Lai. I first of all want to start by saying I had the privilege of meeting the international team of lawyers who are attempting to defend him, even though they have appallingly now been barred from being in Hong Kong by the Chinese authorities. So much is their approval of it, but I want to congratulate them on the huge efforts they're making around the world to draw attention to this, the plight of a man whose only crime is to cry freedom for all those that he lives in and with. And so the point about Jimmy Lai's case is the reality of the change in Hong Kong. The Chinese authorities have trashed the Sino-British agreement that protected people's rights in Hong Kong as a special case, once it was all agreed, and it's an international treaty. And the problem that we've got here now is that under that, therefore, the authorities can proceed against people like Mr. Lai for sedition and other appalling charges. He's already, in the last period, been forced, as it were, to lose his company. He's had the assets of Apple Daily seized. It's unprecedented and could not happen here in the United Kingdom. And here is the point. Hong Kong is, and to some, is meant still to be, a common law area. But it cannot be a common law area if people can have their assets seized on charges that have yet not gone through the courts. This is a peculiarity that we go on pretending this, and some of our justices that serve out there do as well. It is no longer really a common law jurisdiction because it has the national security law over it, and people like Jimmy Lai will now suffer under the national security law without any redress or any protection from what would have normally been the case, for example, here in the United Kingdom, of English common law to our normal and natural rights, which have been completely decimated. And the interesting part about this is that he has been prosecuted in 4 separate sets of criminal proceedings arising from his peaceful participation in that high-profile pro-democracy protest in 2019 and 2020. And these were organised by civil liberties groups. His crime, therefore, is to have attended them. And that alone, apparently, is the key. But the thing is, he's already been prosecuted and found guilty, although one of the charges was dismissed eventually in appeal, but others were upheld. But he'd already served his sentence when that happened. And he now faces even more serious charges. He's faced spurious prosecution on fraud charges, and that was why the equipment was seized. And he was convicted October 22 and sentenced December 22 to 5 years and 9 months imprisonment. The conviction has meant that, as my honourable friend said, he has spent some 1,000 days incarcerated on trumped-up charges. But yet worse is to come. These were all precursors, giving the authorities time to build a case that will put him inside for a minimum of 10 years under the national security law, or up to a maximum of life imprisonment. And the point I want to make about Jimmy Lai, which is a very important point, he could have fled Hong Kong. He had made enough money to leave Hong Kong and go elsewhere and complain about the Hong Kong authorities and the Chinese authorities from outside. But he didn't. He chose to stay in Hong Kong because he knew that if he did flee, then a lot of the hope of what they might eventually be able to achieve would go. He was a beacon. He is a beacon. He is a beacon of freedom and freedom of speech in a way that no other that I know of globally is at present. I don't decry them. I simply say he is remarkable. And that choice to stay put, to stay in Hong Kong, came already with the full knowledge that it would not be for long that he was going to be in freedom at all. And that has happened. He's trumped up charges, and now he faces the delayed, but likely to happen towards the end of this year, maybe in October, a full prosecution under the national security law. And he probably, I will indeed.
Because, of course, my right honourable friend, I, and indeed you, Ms. Ali, attended a conference in Prague over the weekend, full of parliamentarians from around the world, many of whom two of us, have been sanctioned by the Chinese authorities, and the whole subject of Jimmy Lai was very much the focus of that conference. But does my right honourable friend not agree that the issue of Jimmy Lai is not just about Jimmy Lai, it is about what this country stands for? And this country specifically in the case of Jimmy Lai, because of the two criminal acts which the Chinese Communist Party have enacted. One is breaking the Anglo-Sino agreement over Hong Kong, to which we are a signatory, an international treaty, and as a result of their trashing of that treaty, the whole protections under the rule of law that might have applied have been swept away, which is why Jimmy Lai, one of the most successful businessmen whose company was the largest quoted on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, is now facing this prosecution. He is a British citizen, no doubt about that, and he is therefore entitled to the full force of the British government protection. Why has that not been shown, and why have there been no consequences, despite the warm words from Foreign Secretary and others, no consequences for the fact that my right honourable friend and I and 5 other parliamentarians remain sanctioned, and Jimmy Lai remains denied the basic justice which we take for granted in this country?
I'm grateful that he's intervened, because I agree with everything he said, of course. We are sanctioned. We're sanctioned for, in our case, raising the genocide in Xinjiang, another case altogether. So I agree about Jimmy Lai. And I want to come back to the point about Jimmy Lai here, but I just want to say something about the wider case of those many British citizens who languish abroad in different cases. It is too often the case, I'm afraid, that we find reasons and excuses why we somehow can, behind the scenes, do something that will help them without raising the fact that they are British citizens and requiring, therefore, under international law, full consular access and rights. And so I simply say this is a mindset which we now have to get out of. We need to say, if you are a British passport holder, and most importantly, a British citizen, then you have the protection of this United Kingdom, who is supposed to believe in human rights and freedom. I give way to the Honourable Lady.